So, Pluto is indeed a dwarf planet, not a planet. This happened in 2006 when the International Astronomy Union met up in Prague and had a 10-day powwow where they first created the official dwarf planet definition, and stuck Pluto in as a prime example of one. So, why? Well, let's first look at what the current definition of a dwarf planet versus a standard planet is according to the International Astronomy Union. There are three core rules that make up the definition of a planet. A planet is a celestial body that is 1. In orbit around the Sun, 2. Has sufficient mass to assume hydrostatic equilibrium, that is, it has a nearly round shape, and 3, and here's the key one, has quote-unquote cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. So, obviously Pluto meets the first rules. It is most definitely in orbit around the Sun, and it has assumed hydrostatic equilibrium. But it has in fact not cleared its local neighborhood. In order for a celestial body to clear its local neighborhood, it must be the gravitationally dominant body in its orbital zone and have cleared out any similarly sized objects by collision or by acquiring them as one of its own satellites. In essence, given time, celestial bodies of a certain size and influence should naturally become the biggest guys around in its orbital zone. And we define these things as being a planet. Pluto is what we term a Kuiper belt object, an object of ice and rock that moves in and out of the Kuiper belt that extends beyond Neptune to about 50 astronomical units from the Sun. If Pluto had cleared its neighborhood, it would be the biggest thing around in the Kuiper belt, having picked up everything around or sent them careening into deep space by gravitational influence. There essentially wouldn't be a Kuiper belt. Instead, we found that Pluto is not only not alone in the Kuiper belt in terms of bodies of similar size, there's actually other celestial objects there nearby that are larger than it, particularly the dwarf planet Eris, discovered in 2005 and 27% more massive than Pluto, basically 0.27% the Earth's own mass. Dwarf planets are thus defined by meeting only the first two rules, being bodies that orbit our Sun, are rounded out, but they have relatively similar sized company. But why the big hubbub? Why does this matter? Why do we make this be the definition of what is a planet? Well, it's rather simple, really. Pluto's existence was predicted using a now rejected supposition of the relative location of planets in the solar system prior to its discovery in the 1930s, and was heralded at the time as the final planet. The means of observing Pluto and the Kuiper belt were very limited at the time, and Pluto was actually thought to be relatively large, something in the range of Mercury. But in the 1970s, Pluto's moon Charon was discovered, and by using its orbital period, astronomers were able to very accurately calculate Pluto's mass, which was when we discovered that it had actually 1/25th the mass of Mercury's, making it very, very small, much smaller than our own moon, which is sort of troubling. Then, as we came to the 1990s, researchers began to discover even more Kuiper belt objects that were similar to Pluto, with similar orbits, dubbed Plutinos, and it became clear that Pluto really wasn't all that exceptional beyond being easier to spot. Not only that, researchers began discovering more and more objects that were comparable to Pluto's in size in the Kuiper belt, and it became clear that there was in fact a problem. Basically, Pluto didn't jive with the other planets in terms of its characteristics, and if we were going to set a definition of planet that included Pluto, we'd potentially have to add dozens of other planets, with theoretically no top end. Once Eris was discovered, and it was measured to be even bigger than Pluto, well, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Do we add a dozen more planets, with no upper end as we discover more and more really large chunks of ice in the Kuiper belt? Do we go back and make Ceres, located in our asteroid belt in itself a dwarf planet, into a planet too? What about our moon? Why are these being defined as planets when they're just celestial bodies without much influence in their area? Are we really going to classify these things as basically equivalent to the celestial heavyweights that have by force dominated the structure of our solar system after billions of years of development? There are certainly other asteroids near the other planets and so on, but they're most definitely dominated by the planets, and they're entirely because the planets have captured them there. All the dwarf planets we've discovered combined are basically 1/3 the size of our own moon. That's stupid. It's ultimately just a matter of pragmatics. So Pluto was defined as a dwarf planet, as it orbited the Sun and was round, a minor planet, as it's a non-planet sun-orbiting body that isn't a comet, a Kuiper Belt object, as it resides in the Kuiper Belt, a trans-Neptunian object, an object further away from the Sun than Neptune, and a Plutoid/Plutino, because it's a thing like, Pluto. But not a planet. It's not a planet. Some people are bothered by this, but most of that seems to be driven by nostalgia than any sort of rational thing. A fear of change, of things that were once believed in no longer being true, of Pluto somehow being robbed of what is ultimately a term of convenience that doesn't really even apply anymore. If something isn't convenient, and isn't a good convenient definition, and it's made clear that it doesn't really matter, why define it as that? I'd like to just point out how much cooler so many of the other dwarf planets are compared to Pluto. Seriously, Pluto is pretty boring by comparison. Sedna probably deserves its own little thing, but Ceres is also pretty cool too. It's just a random as hell dwarf planet hanging out in our asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, making up 1/3 of the belt's mass. Big enough to be rounded, but not big enough to collapse the rest of the belt onto itself. Eris is even bigger than Pluto, which is pretty cool in itself. How the hell did we not discover this before then? It's further away, not shining? Well, what the fuck? It's just, Pluto really isn't all that interesting anymore. Folks, let it go. Move on. Your heart will go on.